Welcome back, everybody, to the SIP Forum's KYC Summit 2023. This is the third session of the day, of day one. The title of this session is Bringing Purpose to STIRSHAKEN Through Identity with KYC. It's moderated by Rebekah Johnson, founder and CEO of Numerical. Hey, Rebekah.
Hello.
Panelists include Sarah Delphey, who's VP of Trust Solutions at Numerical, Keith Buell, who's General Counsel, Head of Global Public Policy at Numerical. Also Patrick Cardy, Senior Assistant Attorney with the Florida Office of the Attorney General, Consumer Protection Division. And finally, Seth Ray, who's VP of Business Operations at Bandwidth. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Have a great session. Over to you, Rebekah, or Sarah.
Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate that. So welcome everyone to the Numerical sponsored session where we will do our best to help you bring purpose to STIRSHAKEN through identity with KYC. While many of you have implemented STIRSHAKEN, we still see fraud on the network. So this is actually due in part by not properly identifying the calling entity behind the call. This is not a STIRSHAKEN problem, but an identity problem. So the way to drill down to identity is very simple, through knowing who the end customer is. So today we are going to demystify KYC and let you know that it is not impossible. It's actually very doable. So I would like to actually kick off with Keith Buell, because I think it's really important that we first get a little bit of a foundation of, is Know Your Customer a topic of the FCC, and what is the intention behind it?
So the FCC has put in a KYC requirement a year or two ago back, requiring carriers to know their customer. But what the FCC didn't do is really flesh that out. What does that mean? What are the standards? What are the requirements? What are the consequences of getting that wrong or not doing it all? That's still kind of an open question in terms of what the Commission's rules are. And the Commission recently expanded that. They are now requiring carriers to know their upstream provider, which is mostly the same, but a little bit nuanced different. So the requirements of KYC are expanding rapidly, and I think it's time to try to get some meat on those bones as to what participants out there need to be doing.
So I think I'd like to jump right down into Know Your Customer first before we drive down into from like an enforcement side and understanding what service providers are doing today. So Sarah, do you mind just kind of following through? I know Numerical filed a Know Your Customer ex parte as a way of trying to get the information out there and get it into people's hands early as possible. So if you would just kind of take us through that process.
Yeah, I absolutely can do that. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those guides. I think it was in the panel with some representatives from the FCC earlier today. Somebody asked the question, this is great. Is there a template that folks can use for KYC within their organizations so we can, or guidance on what that should be? I think the answer was, that's a great idea. I don't know if that exists today. Would look to industry. So I have good news. It does exist. We put one out there, and so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that today and just give you a brief overview. A couple things to note in the handout section of the webinar, we have both of the documents I'm going to talk about. So you can take a look at those at your leisure, or you can reach out to Numerical, or on the Numerical website, we've got the documents as well for anybody that, if you want to recommend them to others or didn't take them or lose them for some reason. So first document I want to talk to you about is our model standards for KYC review. This was filed as an ex parte with the FCC. So you can find it there. Otherwise, we have it here for you or on our website. Essentially, this is the document that we all wish existed in the universe. It's a models policy for you to use and adapt into your organization for how you're performing KYC review. It's plug and play. It has specific actionable information in here for criteria and data points that you can be using. So I am going to run through that just quickly with you here. So as you can see, we've got the Word document for you. You can adapt this, change this however you see fit. The document is meant primarily for review of legal entity customers rather than consumer customers. However, a lot of the principles that are used for legal entities can also be used for consumers, for anyone that's doing both or primarily working with consumers. So we've got a couple definitions in here for how we're considering end entities or end users versus CSPs or service provider clients that we use throughout. As you can see, it's really the highlighted italicized sections. It's truly meant to be plug and play. Put your name on the top of the list of the dotted line, starting here with detail. How is KYC organized within your organization? Who's responsible? Some suggestions here for some responsibilities you can list for each of the team members. Going through the pre-activation requirements. So first, how do I verify the identity of my client? We have specific lists here for you of data points that we suggest that you collect at a minimum. Certainly can add to these or change these as applied to your business, including some detail on, okay, what's a good physical address, right? How do I confirm that for a client? And understanding the intended use in history. So it goes hand in hand. There's identity and there's the intended use in history. On this side, it's, okay, how do I assess from a website or public materials or answers that I'm getting from my client, what are they doing, right? What are their intended use of service? What kind of communications are they making? And how does that differ between end user clients versus service provider clients, where I may need to go in and do some additional due diligence on their registrations and filings or their KYC policies. Another category that's important here for you to outline in your policy is, okay, how am I going to differentiate between end user versus service provider clients in that flow to make sure they're getting the appropriate level of scrutiny? So section here for you to use for that detail. And enhanced due diligence. So not everybody is necessarily going to be treated the same, right? There are going to be some high risk clients or red flags that should prompt an additional level of due diligence and review. So it gives you a template here to say, okay, here's what I'm identifying as high risk, which we've got more down below, I'll go through. And here's what I'm going to do about that, including suggestions about, escalated approvals, more questions, etc. So post-activation, we go through activity monitoring, some selected pieces of information for you to review for your clients on an ongoing basis. And also how you're going to perform not just activity review, but further KYC, right? So not just getting that information once, but how are you going to ensure it remains up to date? Doing that on a cadence basis, maybe on renewal triggers. So maybe when they hit a certain threshold of activity or capacity use, I want to go back and do another review, reporting, etc. This gives you that opportunity to go in and get a baseline to say, okay, I know I need to do this. Let's detail how I'm going to do it within my organization so that everybody's on the same page. We've also included some information on trial accounts, which in my experience has historically been something for a lot of service providers that trips them up, right? They have a beautiful KYC process and then someone comes out with a free trial for people to go entirely around all of your KYC and just send out traffic without any identification or review. So this is a baseline you can use in your organization to say, here's a reasonable set of practices for what we can do for a trial account and how we can restrict them to ensure that they're not being abused. And then lastly, a couple pieces of meat for you here. These are things that I haven't seen out in the industry that we really want to prompt that conversation. So what are high risk categories or use cases of service? By high risk, we mean, these may be perfectly legitimate, but they may be more regulated or have a propensity for some of the folks in this category to have problematic traffic. So here's a suggested list you can add to or change for what some of those categories might be. And then lastly, red flag behaviors. So these are not necessarily usage related, but behaviors that you may see that should prompt additional due diligence, which this is great to share with your sales team or your customer service team as part of their training to understand, okay, when you see these behaviors, even if they're an existing client, I want you to raise that for an additional level of review back end. So that's just a high level overview. Again, I really suggest that you take some time and run through those. And then the second document that we have for you is our call record review white paper, which this is new. We've released the call record review white paper. I'm not going to go through today in detail, but essentially it outlines, okay, how can you use call records within your organization to monitor customer activity and mitigate fraud? It goes through some high-level information and then also specific metrics, things like short call duration percentage, average call duration, ASR, answer seizure rate. And for each details, okay, what is that? What are uses and limitations for each of those statistics? And then the thing that I don't think anybody has ever released to my knowledge, if it was out there, I would have used it, but specific numbers for each of those metrics to say, okay, what is potentially high risk or potentially low risk that should prompt an additional KYC review to make sure I understand. Maybe it's school notifications or other good robocalls that are causing it to look like this, but this should prompt me to do due diligence. We've laid out those numbers. What's that short call duration percentage? What is that average call length? To prompt that conversation. So whether or not you adopt those exact metrics internally, it's something for you to use to have those discussions internally, as well as the second use is for your own internal purposes, and the second use is for customers. I would often have clients come to me and say, this is great, you're saying I need to do this. How do I put a KYC process in place? What do I need to be looking for? Please help me. I want to be better. Please help me out. And unfortunately, you know, there's only so much time that your team can commit to going in and helping somebody with their practices. So this is a great tool and resource for service providers who serve other service providers to use to say, here's a white paper, here's a template that you can use. Read through these and then come back and let me know if you have any questions on them. So I'm hopeful that these can be useful to you. We've attached the documents for you, and if you have any questions or thoughts on those, please let us know.
So I'm going to speak from a CEO perspective right now with what Sarah just ran through in about 10 minutes. That policy, seriously, I should be charging 10 grand for each download of that policy. It requires someone of her level of experience, expertise, knowledge, understanding, not only of what is the compliance requirements, but how can you deploy it within an organization for it to actually be implemented, which a lot of policies get drafted, it's required, check off, but the employees really can't implement it, or the business just isn't structured to be able to support the policy. Sarah has developed, she is the author of that policy. I am, I had asked her to build one. I was not expecting something to that level. So please take advantage of it. I also wanted to publish this with the FCC, also to put out into the public, you have no excuse. Nobody can say they don't know what a KYC policy looks like. Nobody can say, I don't know where to get information on how to do the ongoing monitoring or what red flags look like. And I think that's a big part of what this conference is this week, is to really put out there that we are all informed now. We should leave this week a very informed industry of exactly what it is that we need to do to protect our networks and our infrastructure. And what I love about having Patrick on this panel is that he comes from consumer protection. What does consumer protection have to do with knowing your customer? It has everything to do, because I am currently personally being impersonated on phishing scams to my employees. It's an active scam I cannot shut down. And every time I get to the root of who is the originating service provider of this, it's like Sarah said, it's been some trial accounts. And then they just get whacked and then they pop up someplace else. So this is what we're talking about. What's that key element that is missing from truly protecting consumers from fraud? Because that's why we do this. It's not going to be a moneymaker. It's not. It's actually going to be requiring you to actually say no to some customers, because you're going to be aware of who those customers are, and you're going to make the right decisions as businesses and leaders to shut off certain traffic. And I loved that last list. That last list that Sarah has on there is just from pure experience. The nastier a customer gets, the higher that red flag gets raised of, you know what, let's cut our losses here and move on. Like, this is not worth the effort. So Sarah, I just had to say that because it's phenomenal what you put out there, and there's nothing like it on the market.
Thank you.
I really appreciate your efforts. And it shows your passion and your care. I mean, you're making it free. It's available. So
I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, it's what I wanted to exist when I started doing this work. So I hope that it's helpful for people, for sure.
well, excellent. So I think we have
and
a
I think
poll.
we did have, yeah, go ahead.
You go for it.
I was just going to say, you know, in the same vein, as much as we're trying to clarify this at the moment, I want to, you know, get some feedback. This is a unique opportunity to ask you. So Mark, I think poll number 1 tee up here.
Okay, the question is, how clear do you feel the standards are for KYC? Select either very clear, somewhat clear, unclear, or very unclear. And we'll collect responses, and I'll close it down and share the results in about 30 seconds or so.
Now I'm wishing we had added one that said clear now that Sarah explained it. Missed it.
As you sit today, how clear do you feel they are?
Okay, so 13% feel it's very clear, 44% say somewhat clear, 35% say unclear, and 8% say very unclear.
Well, I hope that 8% gets converted by the end of this session. That will be our gauge for success. So, all right, well, I want to move on. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, to be fair, Rebecca, I think, you know, for some of those, they may feel like it's for standards. I wonder if some of that is, you know, whether the FCC standards are clear versus whether we think they're clear, but that'll be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of the FCC being clear, the FCC has proposed additional standards for intermediate providers who know their upstream provider. So are there differences in how we approach know your customer versus your upstream provider? And maybe let's start with Sarah first on answering that. Oh, sorry, sure. Keith, I'm sorry. Keith, you're the one that, yeah, from the FCC perspective. Sorry. I always go to Sarah.
I mean, I'll answer them all, but we'll let you answer.
I'll jump in here. The standards aren't all that different. As Sarah and I worked through the creation of that document, 90% of it's probably the same. What I think the FCC didn't quite realize is they said, know your upstream provider, and they use singular. That's not the world we live in. Most carriers are interconnected with a huge number of carriers. A big ILEC/wireless carrier like AT&T and Verizon may exchange traffic with hundreds of different carriers directly and indirectly. And upstream is downstream in a different direction. Calls get originated one way and flow a different way. So your upstream provider today, you're their upstream provider tomorrow. So if the industry is taking these requirements seriously, there should be a lot of knowing your upstream provider going on right now. It's like, you know, you take the thousands of voice service providers and do that web of all their interconnections, and there should be probably tens of thousands of know your upstream provider inquiries happening even as we speak. Is that happening? I don't know.
No. So speaking of, is that happening, Seth, I would really like to get your perspective. I know this is something that Bandwidth is focused on.
Yeah, it's a great topic. You know, when you think about from the Bandwidth's perspective, and kind of the job I have is to look at our customers and find out what they're doing. But many times our customers, then their customers, and even sometimes their customers are just as important. And actually, the further on down the line, the harder this concept of KYC gets. And that's why in our case, you know your customer, know your upstream, downstream. All these processes are so intertwined for us because the idea is, do we know what's being done with our services? Do we know what's being offered, using them? And so for us, I probably spend as much time with my team trying to talk to our customers about what they're doing with their end users or their customers when they're selling these services out, and find out if they're, holding them to the same standard we are, which is harder, right? Because we can have our own standards and we can make those rules in kind of the world that we control. Outside that world, trying to run a business, but also educate your customers in not a way that feels, like if you don't do this, bad things will happen, which is a true statement, is very hard to walk that line because we want to be, customer forward here, but at the same time, there's a standard that we have to uphold for our customer to do there. So it's definitely a balance.
And it'll be interesting, Patrick, to hear from your perspective, because you're looking at this from the consumer. And I'll be curious to know, does it matter if it's upstream, downstream? No, eventually all this information makes it down to a consumer, and fraud's committed against the consumer or not. So I'd be really interested on what your thoughts are when in the service provider world, we're trying to break up the different chunks. Does it matter? Should we? What are your thoughts?
So I think it's the most important thing is that you should not be accepting traffic unless you know that there's someone on the other end of the customer relationship that doesn't intend to send illegal traffic and is going to take meaningful action to remove it if necessary. So, whether it's an end user that's on the other side of that relationship, whether you have a relationship with a call center or whether it's another upstream provider, you're right. From the consumer's perspective, it doesn't really matter. I mean, a fraud call or an unwanted call is just as dangerous and harassing whether you transmitted it from a call center or from another provider. So understanding how somebody is using your services is absolutely paramount. And, that use might change over time. So being able to respond when you notice those changes is also essential. And that's when knowing that you have somebody on the other end of your customer relationship that will actually take action to stop the bad traffic. That's the key, and that's what'll keep you out of trouble from an enforcement perspective.
Yep. And I wanted to highlight in the KYC framework that Sarah covered, she did touch on who is the customer that you're looking to know, and called out that there are some differences if you put an entity in that upstream provider versus a calling entity. So Sarah, if you could maybe just highlight a couple of those, what are those key differences that distinguish between the two?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's sometimes people have a lot of difficulty with certain clients figuring out, okay, is this a service provider or not? It's something that I predict there's going to be a lot of discussion on, because as soon as we establish a policy for KYC, we have to get better at figuring out proactively whether our customers are service provider or not. I mean, Seth knows we spent a lot of time figuring this out back in the day, and there's still questions that come up on it. So it's really about for you to ask yourself as a service provider, do I know who the end user is? Do I know who this is? And do I feel like I have meaningful control over it and fully understand that? And the way that you do that, it can vary. We've got the framework in there, but the key difference in terms of the result for what you should do in review is obviously if it's a service provider, you are taking on additional risk, right? You are opening yourself up such that you don't get to review every single new customer of your customer per se. So I call it dating, right? You need to know, what are your policies? How many people do you have that are doing this? How much doing this work, right? If your service provider customer appears to be one person and there don't appear to be any other meaningful employees, you don't have robust KYC. It takes time. I got to tell you, there's no way of doing it at scale, right? So it's about, understanding what are your processes and policies. Can I see your KYC policy? Are you registered in the RMD? Do you have a robocall mitigation plan? Are you STIRSHAKEN compliant? Are you signing your own calls? All of these questions are important and distinct when it's a service provider customer.
Thank you. And I know we've only been talking about the US and the FCC, but this concept of knowing your customer is not just within the FCC. We're already seeing this at an international level. Ofcom is publishing, information around what is knowing your customer, what should we be looking at, what should the industry be doing. So, I think the key thing here is that this concept of know your customer is not new whatsoever. And we're just continuing to see that conversation expanding really on a global movement kind of approach. It's the same processes that were utilized and are utilized in the financial industry to prevent fraud. But we're just seeing it merge over into telecom and knowing your customer. Obviously, with some nuances of our infrastructure and that concept of that upstream, downstream, perhaps in the financial space, knowing who your customer is, it's the one who's actually filling out the application. And it doesn't necessarily have multi-layers to it. So it is more complex when it comes to that side of applying KYC. So I'd like to go back to the panelists with a question of, for the KYC standards in the market, do we feel that they are clear? If not, why? And should there be one standard? Is that the right approach? I'd like to get some feedback. And Seth, maybe we could start with you on how you're handling this as an international organization.
Yeah. I think the core question here, is it clear? I think that the end result is clear, and the idea that getting rid of anonymity, getting rid of this kind of question mark of, you send your services out into the customer ether and you sure hope that bad things don't happen, because many good companies are trying to provide needed, required services, but at the risk of having someone come in and use them for horrible things. And obviously that's why we're all here. And so how do you get to that point, I think, is what's unclear. What Sarah has published, I think, and then internationally, I guess, is kind of the spin we're talking about now. How you operationalize and how you put into effect a team that can be both customer friendly, driving revenue that any company would want to do, but also have a very strong backbone that is ultimately, these are the no's. These are the things we cannot go without having in order to do business. We can't go without having basic business information, knowing what the end user is doing, knowing if they should own these phone numbers, what they're doing with these phone numbers, what they're doing with these call-in features. I think that is unclear in some ways on how you operationalize it. I think that we're taking steps toward that, right? I think that different companies have tried different things. I know I'm excited to share, I know in a little bit later, about how we've kind of operationalized some of the more nuts and bolts there. But I do think the encouraging part is we know what we're marching toward, and that is trying to get to a world where you could ask, any given, hopefully, if it's a sales rep, if it's someone in operations, if it's a customer-facing individual at a company, hey, what is this customer doing with our services, and what is the actual end user at the end of the day doing with it? They could give you a really concise and confident answer, and not just say, well, the company offers X, but I'm not really sure what happens after that. To me, that's the goal. It's a logical, pragmatic goal, and that's what I like about it. It's getting it operationalized that is the head scratcher. And the mix of manual work with automation is, I think, a very interesting one, because most of the things we talk about now, we're always driving toward automation, right? We always want to immediately figure out a way to not have to put, people in seats to do this work. And I think there's an expertise area, an individual contributor, kind of SME type of person out there that is becoming more and more valuable because of this area. It's just because it's just kind of a black box to some folks. So, internationally, I guess, to get back to that though, for us, as everyone knows, we acquired an international business a few years back, and this figuring out how the standards for that business meshed into the ones we had started to establish in the U.S. were very difficult. And internal kind of disagreement on some of those topics, figuring out what we need to focus on, what is perhaps a waste of energy to focus on because it isn't relevant yet in a certain country, but using that North Star of knowing what our customers are doing, knowing what our services are being used for at the very end of that trail is what we're building all our processes based on.
That's great. And I do look forward to digging down into the operational side, which is one of the key takeaways that I wanted to do with this session. I love actionable sessions where it's just not a lot of talk, but people walk away being able to do something. Sarah, I know you've got some perspectives on maybe even some of the activities at a global scale that this is not a new topic to the world. So where else are we seeing this?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen this in the financial industry, where in the realm of anti-money laundering regulation and other financial regulations to understand identity for financial transactions across the globe. There's a ton of parallels there, a ton to learn. I'll just say on the global perspective, there's a purely practical issue, which is identity is designated by governments for who's a legal entity, for who's a service provider. Governments decide fundamentally who those are and what credentials get issued and what information you have to give to get those credentials, and it varies globally. So we're going to have to come to terms with how do we understand what data we have on who, and this is where I get excited, things like Glyph, the legal entity identifier, the LEI, which just came because of this problem in the financial industry as a sort of key linking identifier to, you know, businesses that are multinational. How do we tie that back to one identity? So we're going to have to look at solutions like that to solve similar issues when it comes to global telecom.
Thank you. And Keith, you know, you're general counsel, but also head of global public policy, because you have had experience at a telecom level of what is the compliance for policing your customers and traffic at a global scale. So, you know, from a regulatory perspective and compliance perspective, I know you had some thoughts to contribute.
Yeah, I spent some time at a global telecom company that operated all around the world. And these KYC standards in the US are trickling out around the world because calls originate from overseas, good calls and bad calls, and make their way to the United States. And a gateway provider may be affiliated with a wholesaler who's selling to a BPO, selling to a call center, selling to the actual entity making the call, most of which is all overseas, but the KYC standards are trickling up because of the requirements that we have here. And the foreign caller, they struggle. I've been asked, the basic question is, how do I not get in trouble and how do my calls not get labeled or blocked? And as someone who's dealt with this for decades in the United States, it's very difficult to come up with a clear, concise summary of TCPA, FTC rules, state rules, KYC policies, all that to give guidance to someone with a different cultural and legal background, not vetted in US law, to say this is what you need to do to be compliant. I struggled with that, let alone a company that did not have someone with that level of depth of knowledge. So it definitely is you know, exporting what we know here around the world for hopefully for better.
And Patrick, when it comes to clarity around KYC standards, from the consumer protection side, again, I know your perspective and thoughts on that might be just a little bit different in how you view it. So if you could kind of share some of your ideas on really what it means. What are we drilling down to?
Sure. Well, I mean, it certainly is difficult because there isn't a one size fits all, and you know, what you need to do to keep bad traffic off your network is going to change over time because, you know, there's just no shortage of creativity when it comes to people trying to figure out new ways to steal using voice services. There's never going to be one standard because as soon as what you have to do is written down, then somebody will figure out a way around it. Really, I think it's important to understand that the ultimate goal behind these is to keep the bad traffic off your network. And so you need to have an understanding of what the various metrics and various aspects of the customer relationship that you're looking at really mean, not just to apply kind of a rigid and formulaic approach. So, I mean, if you're looking at traffic and you're talking about short duration percentage, like it wouldn't be sufficient to say, oh, well, we have only 5% of calls under 6 seconds, but to miss that, you know, 90% of your calls are between 15 and 30 seconds or something like that. And that is indicative of a customer who's programmed their robocall to, you know, be that length because they have control over what the shape of the traffic that they're sending is to some extent. So understanding, you know, training the people that have a relationship with the your customers to know what it is that they're looking for, to know what it is that all of the different factors that you're instructing them to look at mean. I think that's really key. It's not just we have the plan and now we tick off the boxes. You've got to train your people to understand what it is that the plan means as well, so they can look at people trying to game that system. Because at the other end of the people that we're trying to keep off the network are essentially just thieves in many respects, and they're going to try and figure out new and better ways to use your services to try and abuse consumers.
And actually, I think it's a challenge for the seat that you're in when you're looking at where the fraud's coming from, right? So it's as simple as, where is this fraud that's hitting consumers? How do I stop the fraud? It's a very simple kind of approach to it. But the issue is that the funnel, the spigot through which this fraud is coming through, we have to look at it and go, well, why? Why this particular channel is used? There's a lot of ways to defraud people, but why this particular channel? So in our conversations as we were preparing for this, that's what I mentioned. My thoughts were is anywhere there's anonymity, you're gonna have fraud. It's a great way to hide. And I know you had some pretty strong, thoughts on that with regards to, the anonymity and what you're seeing, why this is such a really attractive space for fraudulent actors to exploit.
So, I mean, you're exactly right that anonymity invites abuse of voice services, and the role of KYC is to try and eliminate that anonymity to the greatest extent that you can. As we've mentioned, free trials that invite people to use your services for a short time and don't have the same kinds of due diligence and information gathering on the front end will attract bad traffic, because people can get their message out, can place millions of calls in a short amount of time to try and find those vulnerable people to take advantage of, and you don't know who they are. So when the subpoenas come around, when the investigations start, you're not going to be able to say, it's not me, it's my customer, and it was this person, and here's the actions that we took to stop it when we became aware of the misuse of our systems. As a voice service provider, it puts you in a very precarious position. Anonymity is great for the fraudster, and it is terrible for everybody else that's either receiving or in the call path.
Yep. And I'm just guessing, wild guess, how many of those companies that you have identified a lot of fraudulent traffic had a really strong KYC policy?
The policy is often one thing, and their follow through on the policy is often quite another thing. You can have a great robocall mitigation database entry, and you can say that you're doing all of these things, but at the end of the day, if your relationship is such that your customer tells you, oh, well, we've kicked this source of bad traffic off our network, can you, let us back onto the services, and you just take it at face value and you don't monitor and take the other steps that your policy lays out, then it doesn't matter that you have a well-articulated policy. You're not really following through, and you're not making people experience the consequences of sending you bad traffic. And so, I mean, the follow through is the most important thing for me as an enforcer. I find that the cases where, somebody does have a good policy, but they just didn't follow it, are some of the ones that are easier to argue, because, obviously it sort of seems at that point like you were, just tempted by the fact that you can make money off of these things, and that you knew better, that you understood that there was a problem, that you articulated what the problem was and how to address it, and then you didn't. And, in an enforcement action, I'm going to be making the case to the fact finder that your reasons for not following through on that policy are enough to make you liable.
That right there is the whole show. That's the message. And I actually used to work in privacy and security compliance, especially in the healthcare space. And we had to publish our privacy policies. And if we had a breach, or if there's any kind of breach, that was known in the industry, that you said you were going to protect data and you did not protect data. These consumers were harmed. And definitely, Patrick, what you mentioned right there, that's what it was all about, the operational side, all of the documenting, the logging, when I was aware, who took action. And when I had established this and running it, it had to be viewed by someone higher up than me. I was definitely making sure someone higher up knew what was being done, what decisions were being made, so that at least somebody could override me if it needed to be overrided. But you have to put the complete operational side into it. So I just, that really needs to be heard. That this is not a, oh, I published my RMD policy on the FCC website, therefore I'm done. There's some really pathetic policies in the RMD you should be embarrassed about. And if your KYC reflects your RMD policies, we're in trouble. Like, that's not good. It's just, we're not placating the federal government. We're not placating the state side. What you're hearing is you need to do your job. You have a responsibility. If you're going to play in this game, those are the rules of the game. That used to be the mantra that I would share with the executives. If you want to play the game and make money in this game, you got to follow the rules of the game. So that leads us right into, I really want to kick off with Seth. He kind of did a little teaser about how do we operationalize this. So feeding off what Patrick said, you must do this part. Everybody, please listen up. This is incredible that Seth is going to share his kind of experiences and background on actually how to operationalize this.
Yeah. So rare that I get an audience that's super excited about hearing about this topic. So, kind of great opportunity to just talk about the last few years of what I've done at Bandwidth. As many of you know, Sarah and I worked together for a while. Just so exciting to see her recent guidance published, and it would be lying if I didn't say that a lot of what we're doing at Bandwidth was based off of a lot of the work that Sarah originally brought to the company, and kind of things that she's continued to build on. So it's really cool to look at what she's published and then look at what we're doing and continue to refine what we're doing. And it's also encouraging to see that we're doing in many of these things. And so it's cool to see that come out and then say, is it working, right, in practice? And so what I want to talk about a little bit is how it's working for us, how we've operationalized it. So I want to split this up into kind of two different process flows. One is the new customer. So, new customers coming inbound to Bandwidth, whether it's through a marketing lead, whether it's through an inbound. And we've got, know your customer guidance right there at the front door. So if you get an inbound lead, you think about an inbound customer coming to your company who's very desperate to get phone numbers, very desperate to get turned up very quickly. Those are those are immediately red flag, right? Because you typically, especially when you see what's happening now with more and more focus being put on traffic quality, robocall mitigation, you see customers getting kicked off. They're getting pushed off. Our competitors, they're looking for a place for their traffic to land. And so right up front, we want to put things in that marketing team even, so they can know that if they see a desperate lead coming in who's got all these numbers and dollar signs that of course get any sales org very excited, which is what they're there for. But we also want to give them the opportunity to be a good business partner and turn down this business after a set of qualifying questions, which many of those are in Sarah's document. Just what are you going to use the service for? What are some of your traffic profiles? Short call duration, average length of call, and even just doing a little bit of business research on their own. We've taught some of our SDRs, some of those frontline folks, to be able to go look at a website, run through the product descriptions, and many leads get killed that way. These are things that never make it to my team, which is really the KYC team. And that's how we really see the long-term growth happening and of health of our business, is that we just we don't spend any time on this stuff. However, many of these companies have good and bad traffic. And so you see them get a step further. Let's take a deeper look at them. We see some red flags, but we do want to open an opportunity, assign some revenue to it, and then we kick it off to what we call our risk team. This is a team we've had in place for about 4 or 5 years with that name. It's taken different shapes. It used to be more of kind of a credit and business health check, but as KYC is really taken more of a front, kind of a leading role there. We've now got a team of experts who's looking at every single qualified opportunity. So there is no prepaid option. We shut that down a long time ago. As we talked about, that was a huge issue for us to bring in customers that can just swipe a credit card and go. It's great for business development in some ways. And so finding a way to do that that's responsible, Sarah has outlined this as well, is so important for your business, right? Because you want to give customers a seamless way to try your products, but you want to put bumpers in place. You want to put, CPS limits. You want to put NPS limits. You want to put things in place that make that trial impossible for a customer to do bad things with it, which is very difficult. And it will be a hard thing for you to sort of drive through your business as you're developing these processes, because it will be seen as something that could potentially kill business. But it's really important, I think, to stay focused on that. So there's that step. And then once we get to a full risk assessment, we send out a profile form to our customers and we say, fill out this basic information. It's information that allows us to sort of say up front, hey, we are going to need some things from you. So it kind of sets this tone of, this isn't just please have your business, we'll do anything for it. It sets a tone of, we're going to be working back and forth with information gathering. So we gather that information, we send it through a team, and that from that point on, that opportunity is locked. And so you can't push it forward, you can't move it into a closed scenario. These are the controls that I think are really important for, no matter how well-intentioned your business is about doing KYC, like Patrick was just talking about, if you're not executing on it, if you're not willing to make sacrifices, I think, for your sales cycle and for some of your closed data, you're going to have problems, because you will have people who get so excited about a deal or pushing it forward that they will just fly right through these gates if they're not very, very much controlled. From that point, we go do a pretty full tilt business review. Again, we walk through all of the business entity information that Sarah has outlined, the RMD registration. We want to look at sample calls. We want to get CDRs from you. We want to look at some of the profile of your calls to see, again, Patrick, great call out on, there are ways to make CDRs, whether it's fabricated or real, look like they aren't that bad from a macro level. When you get to a more micro level and you start to drill down on that data, you will see where there's unhealthy traffic living in there, if not all of it being very unhealthy. Once a customer's made it past that stage, there's improved rating, there's notes given. There's occasionally an escalation process for, say the risk team said no, you want to look at a higher level there of executive review on the account. Have we talked to the customer on a call? Have we talked to them about these red flags? Do they have a plan to remediate some of the issues that are on their website or other things that we see that could crop up? And if you get through all that, come on board to be a bandwidth customer. This is phase 2. This is when you're a customer. And now what are we going to do? We don't just let you go and let it rip on calls per second and everything else. We want to have a very, very healthy and frequent touch point with you. We want to have automated. This is where automation comes in, which is awesome, because you don't have to ask for a 10-person team to do those reviews. Doing the reviews in an automated fashion is very, very hard to do, because as you can imagine, things will get gamed, things will get, it's just so much harder unless you have those eyes on it. Once a customer is on board, automated dashboards, and we're looking at all of these call health statistics, weekly meetings with a closed group of people that represents account managers on the sales side, customer service managers on that operations side, folks in finance, because obviously if we're talking about a customer that is billing a lot and we see problems and we're going to have to take action that will result in that bill go down, you want to have your finance folks in the room. You want to have all these. It really turns into kind of a deal review team. And you really have to think of it that way. You can't think of it as, you're just the executioner, you're just coming in to take deals out. You have to think of it, from the standpoint of giving your good customers the capacity, the attention, and that healthy network that they're paying for. Because what ends up happening are these bad customers, they take support resources, capacity, the amount of tickets, the amount of demand that they have. Many of the red light factors Sarah talked about in her document around customers that are very demanding, they're very pokey and proddy on, hey, why are you doing this? And I don't like it when you do that. These are all the types of customers we're talking about, and they're the ones that are going to cost you the most, both in that moment in support cost and long-term, the liability they represent. There's a lot of business reasons here too, which I think help, and obviously the elephant in the room reason, which is they're robbing you, right? They're robbing consumers, as Patrick was saying. So we put all these things together in a health metric dashboard review. Huge part of my weekly cadence with my team. Huge part of the entire operations cadence really is people, when they see anything, they come to my team. Hey, I'm seeing something. Can I get this put in the health dashboard review? Can we talk about it this week? I want to know if I'm being too critical or if this is something we should be looking into. Should a customer stay on that review board too long? Should we give them critical dates and key metrics they need to hit and they do not? Then things get much more serious. And ultimately that could lead to what we call an AUP disconnection. So a disconnection based on violating our acceptable use policy. And this is the last thing I'll say here. I'm running my mouth a little bit, sorry, Rebecca, but the last thing I'll say is you have to have a really well-baked offboarding process for this second process I'm talking about to work. You have to be nailing it when it comes to automation and turning down capacity, sending out customers the right notification so that they, there is a good paper trail for when you told them why you're turning them off. Weekends, nights, many times these things have to happen like that. We get a key piece of information that it makes it there's no escalating, there's no decision making. We are turning this customer off immediately. We have, before we had a really well-baked offboarding process, this gets really clunky, and it honestly, it makes it harder for the business to want to act quickly because you have to just really get that kind of cruise ship in motion to offboard a customer. And I think that's probably a good place to kind of just stop for a second, but those kind of represent the two pieces of how we've operationalized it. I have a few stats to share, but I'll pause there for a second because I've been talking a little bit.
Yeah, I'm going to hone in on what is really important from a business perspective is while we have shared a policy, that is your course direction that you should be heading. A policy is used to audit how you are doing. The policy in and of itself is nothing but words on a paper. So taking that and operationalizing it, and Seth, the departments that I heard you mention include marketing, sales, client support, contract, finance, and really executive leadership oversight. Meaning this whole process of keeping bad actors off of a network is not something you assign one person. It's not something you assign one department. It has to be a way of operating, and that does start at the C-level. If the C-level is not behind it, unfortunately, because I have been in these positions, you could have the biggest heart in the world and really want to implement a KYC policy within your organization, but if your executive leadership is not behind you, please go find an organization that appreciates you so you can be successful. And you probably don't want to be there with that company because it literally is a matter of time before someone comes knocking on their door. So that's, I think everything that you shared, Seth, is really the story that the listeners need to hear. That it is a large task. And if you're starting from scratch, there's a lot of work to catch up on from that perspective. Now I'm going to throw a little numerical plug, mainly because I sponsored this and I can. So this is my passion. This is what I did in my prior career, and I absolutely love that I can run a company and implement KYC in the way I always wanted to. And that is knowing your customer and then applying a trust criteria and then establishing that throughout the entire ecosystem. And that's the reason why Sarah is the Vice President of Trust Solutions. There wasn't even this title that existed out in the workforce. I mean, you couldn't Google it.
Up, yeah.
We just made it up. I'm like, how do we describe this? Because it was a new role, and I was like, Sarah, this is a challenge here. You're gonna own trust. And I want that trust to go down to the consumer. That also means trust with our vendors, trust with our partners, trust with our providers, right? It's how do we infiltrate that throughout the entire ecosystem? And another key thing is that she reports to me. It's important that the trust solution leader reports to the executive level. and then her work gets distributed down. She's not in the departments, she's a line right from me, and then everybody knows she has a role and a part in ensuring that this KYC is distributed throughout. And so that is what our platform is. It's an entity identity management. I wanted to automate this for service providers so that they can stay on top of who their customers are. We could have a solution that allows you to get your customers. This is already up and running today. This to me is my legacy that I'm leaving behind. I want to make a dent in this. I really, really, really want to make a dent in fraud because I have been a victim of fraud, and people we all know, my next door neighbor got the police one, siphoned money out of her, she's retired. It's like, come on. If you want to play in this particular industry, there is a responsibility that comes with it. Just like being a doctor or being a lawyer, there are certain fields and certain industries where there's a moral, ethical responsibility. And I think telecom is there now. We have to bring that into this industry. So with that, sometimes I get on a rant and I just have to go. Steph, you inspired me. But I want to continue on one last little thing, is the contracting. You mentioned the offboarding, and that really is important to empower your business to be able to do the offboarding, and that does come at a contract level. So if you would just kind of touch a little bit on what does someone need to do when they're looking at their contracts when they are implementing a KYC? How do they offboard customers in a legal way, in a compliant way?
Yeah, you know, we have provisions in our contracts around, you know, this acceptable use policy that is pretty clear. It gives us a lot of leverage. You can access those on our website. That gives us, you know, very quick ability to offboard a customer for all these reasons that we're talking about. You know, I think that one's pretty straightforward because you know, we've just really retained a lot of leverage to be able to act quickly. I think that there's the one that gets a little bit weirder is when you've got a situation where you may not have a singular event that's so severe that it triggers your AUP, but the partnership isn't there. You have a bad partner, you have a customer who's just not, you know, they may have 70, 80, 90% of their traffic is pretty clean, but they've got a subset of, you know, free trials or something that's just letting in little gremlins here and there that we've been able to solve. They've seemingly been maybe kind of collaborative, but then that falls apart, and you need to just part ways. And maybe it's a 30-day, it's a 60-day, you can move your numbers, you know, just you know, this isn't working. It's kind of like a bad relationship there. That one's a little bit harder because you want to lean on other potentially less nuclear option kind of contract clauses. So I think having a really, really tight termination section in your MSA or whatever document you're using to sell services is really important here. One that, you know, you work with your contracts team. In my case, I work with my legal team, and I say, these are the things I need to be able to do to run my KYC like I need to, and to make quick and speedy decisions. You know, give me those tools. And I think that that's a really important conversation for you to have if you're building a KYC team, fraud mitigation team, is to make sure you are in lockstep with your legal team. You may be, you know, everyone's organized differently. We have an operations unit that stays very close to our customers when it comes to KYC. That it's not part of the legal team, but we partner with them, and we have a very tight cadence with them to make sure that anytime we need to make a quick action, they've given us the tools to do that, and we have the documentation and ability to handle that all on our own. We actually generally generate all of our own AUP and termination letters in the operations unit because, you know, like I said, we're the closest to the customer.
So Patrick,
Yeah,
based on, oh, go ahead.
Want to add to that real quick. I 100% agree with everything Seth said. The only thing I'll add is that it's a really great bellwether as well. If you're really clear in your contract policy about what you don't take, and you have language in there about aggressive penalties that you can take, your prospective customers will self-select and identify themselves to you that are going to be violating that policy. So if you put that up front and make it really clear, hey, from the perspective of, you know, we want to be totally transparent. We have goals for traffic. This is what we're trying to hit, and this is what the kinds of things, you know, others may take your traffic. We've chosen not to do that here. So sorry, but if you do any of these things, we're going to have to shut it down. Even people who might not have otherwise been transparent to you often will then raise their hand and say, wait, hold on, can we remove that from the contract? And then, you know, you can have that conversation about why it makes things a lot easier for you.
Yeah, I literally, the redlining of a contract, you can hand one to me, not tell me anything about that customer, and I'll know right away based on all the rep and warrants that they're cutting out of it. It's like, we'll just pass. There is no reason for me to even respond because if that's their first step.
You can even find out in the sales process. Some of our sales reps have come to me and said, we had a customer approach and we talked to them, but they said, you asked too many questions. I'm going to go somewhere else. I love that answer. If your sales reps are getting that response, you know you're doing something right. And Numerical's in a little bit different spot. We're screening customers to vouch for them with you know, their call reputations. We're not a voice service provider ourselves, but the parallels, the KYC expectations are quite similar.
Yeah, but I mean Keith, that is the reason why, you know, I founded this company, was because my clients, which were like Walmart, Walgreens, CVS, Bank of America, like all these large brands, had their calls labeled fraud or spam. And I never fought the FCC on saying, hey, you shouldn't label calls fraud or spam. It was, okay, there really needs to be a safe way for good actors to get their calls through. I was very involved in hospital communications and emergency communications. So my mind has always been on how do we protect the good callers, and that's when this concept came about. Is I looked at my legal entities and I said, are you willing to disclose who you are? Are you willing to disclose your consent management, your opt-out management? Are you using an auto dialer? Like what, those are your trust criteria, that you know what you're doing. And it was a resounding absolutely from legal actors. They do not have this. In fact, it's like, yes, because you're going to be treated like a legal actor and not a fraud actor. And they want that. So one of my concerns was, in exchange for verifying your identity, you wouldn't be labeled fraud. Well, I didn't want fraud actors coming through the process. So we have that established, and we've absolutely had companies that try to come through. And I have absolutely no issue saying go pound sand. It's like, problem is though, and we actually kind of got a question about this, and I wanted to bring it up, is, you know, what do we do? And this is moving us into like the future of what else do we still need to do. But when Numerical does tell a customer or a prospect, sorry, not us, you're looking for a solution that actually helps you avoid the identification of fraudulent and spam traffic, I don't share that with anybody. I don't have a place to put that. And we have termed customers and they get super nasty, really ugly. And it's like, I feel like I should warn someone. Even some of our customers have even come to us going, now that I'm very aware of like this whole customer process, we had one that I'm really concerned that they're going to commit fraud, but there's no place to put this information. So, you know, Sarah, I'd love to hear, or Seth, if there's anything that you've done, or is this just falling to the floor?
Yeah, I mean, I can answer that. There are times in which, you know, it crosses a line such that you do reach out to law enforcement. But some of these may be cases where somebody, you can't necessarily tell that their call practices are illegal, but they have one person on a terrible website and a business that was just created 5 minutes ago. And so you decline them, but you don't necessarily, you know, feel that it rises to the level that, okay, I need to, it's hard to decide whether, okay, I need to proactively report this person to law enforcement versus just that they don't meet my criteria. So I do think it's open, and I love to hear Patrick's take as well on it. Because that it can be tough for service providers. You also don't want to feel like you're being anti-competitive and slandering somebody that may come back and bite you if they hear, you know, well, such and such said to another service provider that I suck, and so nobody wants to do business with me now. There's some other legal concerns there too. So yeah, it's tough.
So let's move on into kind of some predictors from, you know, the future, what we're seeing down the pipeline. I'd actually like to start, because we're kind of closing in on time here. I want to hear from Patrick first on, from a regulatory, what are we expecting down the pipeline? I feel like we're just laying bricks on this little pathway here. We are definitely implement KYC, and Patrick goes, well, my job's taken care of now. There's no more bad traffic. I know you're thinking about the future and what's next. So I would really like to get your perspective.
So in terms of enforcement, my particular area of the world, we've been focused on finding the people that have the best opportunity to mitigate bad traffic, and a lot of the smaller intermediate carriers that are acting as gateways for this bad traffic see kind of like trunks where there's really concentrated illegal robocalls coming through, and they are they see their call detail records for this traffic. They're getting tracebacks about it. It's pretty easy as an enforcer to make the case that they know that they are bringing illegal robocalls across their network. And, the goal is certainly not to make the industry less competitive or to shut down, any given subset of the industry, but it's those companies that are not willing or are not able to address this known issue with fraudulent calls coming across their network. They're the ones that we're looking to either put some guardrails around them and help them to run a business that doesn't flood the U.S. phone network with illegal robocalls, or to shut them down. And I always hear the argument, well, the bad traffic is just going to go to somebody else, but the idea is that there'll be a strong sort of backbone of good providers who are turning away the sources of bad traffic, providing a competitive service that keeps rates down for consumers and are doing things the right way, and that bad traffic gets shunted to a hopefully increasingly small number of irresponsible actors, and enforcement is targeted against those people, so that we maintain the competitive advantage for having a wide open hyper-competitive marketplace, but we are able to stop the fraud calls that have been the #1 source of consumer complaints for FTC and FCC and many state attorneys generals. So that's, from my perspective, kind of the overarching goal of current robocall enforcement. Things will change as scams change, but you'll see some of the actions that we filed recently are aimed at identifying and stopping the most irresponsible folks that have the best position within the market to curtail the illegal traffic that's coming through.
Yeah. And I actually hadn't thought about it, Patrick, till you mentioned it when you were describing how if service providers start to implement a KYC, they go through this painful process that Seth mentioned, and the bad actors, they're hitting dead ends each time, and then they eventually go find the one that's open, the loophole one. That actually might funnel a bunch of the more bad traffic to that particular company, which then gets a higher alert on your radar and allow you to be able to shut that down. So I think it's going to be really interesting. I would love to have these conversations again next year. I think we should be looking at and looking to our enforcement side to say, are we improving as an industry? Are you seeing trends with the implementation of KYC? And maybe those that you are filing enforcement against, once you dig down into there, you realize, wow, they actually implemented everything. So that means there's something else we haven't looked at. And I know in healthcare, I was definitely involved from that perspective of it was in the breach area because hospital healthcare organizations were just being targeted left and right because the patient information be sold, and there's all kinds of nefarious things you can do with it. But we learned as a community, because we would come together and start sharing, what is it that we're all doing that's working, and what is this pattern with, we're good actors. Like, we were really good companies, but there were still some vulnerabilities. So it allowed us to shore up some areas that maybe we hadn't really recognized, whether it was from a law perspective saying I need to look over there, but we as an industry could come together and go, let's shore up this area through standards. And that's where I think the relationship, especially for KYC, I want to see a little bit more of a interwoven aspect of it. It shouldn't live solely in standards and it shouldn't live solely in law, but there is definitely a relationship between the two, and it's been successful in other industries. So no reason not to. So that will be an interesting one. I'd love for us to stay on top of that. Keith, I have one thing from you. If you have any trends or predictions from a regulatory perspective, I know we just had a round of comments that were filed. What more should we expect to see?
I can't keep track of the NPRMs and all that. I think we're on the 8th report in order, something like that. I generally know what's in them, but don't quiz me on the particulars. But the general trend is that the FCC is closing exemptions and loopholes and extensions. And I think that's a great thing, because just based on, it's kind of anecdotal, but personal experience, when I look at my call log, 2 years ago when the first STIRSHAKEN deadline hit, I think it was June of 2021. Since then, most of the ones that have the green check mark in my iPhone call log are from other major wireless service providers. It's Verizon, formerly Sprint, T-Mobile, and AT&T that got this up and running the most quickly. But when I get a call from a local small business, that still rarely has a check mark. Somewhere along the call route, that STIRSHAKEN information is being dropped. And there are large providers out there doing a lot of call routing that still have not put STIRSHAKEN into effect. A lot of the exemptions end in 2.5 weeks, June 30th. I'm hoping to see better results then, but so much of what we've done thus far has really missed the mark because of these exemptions and the call routing. If I could write the rules myself, I would make it so if you're an intermediate provider, you must implement STIRSHAKEN, no exceptions, no excuses ever. And I know the FCC is sympathetic to small and rural providers who might have old-fashioned TDM switches and don't have the customer base to justify expensive upgrades. Fine, they can stay on TDM, but anyone who wants to put themselves in the middle of the call path, all STIRSHAKEN, all SIP, no exceptions, period. I don't know if they'll adopt that, but that's my soapbox.
If you rule the world, all right. Well, we got a lot of questions. I was actually going to do a, hey, let's go around and everybody give their closing thoughts, but we have enough questions that I think we should probably give some time towards that. I can select them. So for panelists, we have them written out in our documents here that we're looking at. I like this one. I don't know who's going to answer it. We're going to ask it. Why are international actors allowed to register as U.S. voice service providers? And how do we stop that, if we should stop that?
I'll take that one. There's very little regulation. If you want to become a licensed CLEC or an IXC, there are hoops to jump through, but in the kind of unregulated world of just least cost routing and traffic exchange, there's very little. You don't even need to get an OCN from NECA, which is the entity that issues what's an operator carrier number, I think. I just call it an OCN. I might have gotten the acronym wrong. But that has been a prerequisite to getting a STIRSHAKEN token. And so, but you can do a lot of business in the voice world, routing traffic, providing various types of services without ever getting on the radar screen of being a formal regulated carrier. And those can be international or domestic. So I think it's a little short-sighted for the STIGA, the governance authority for STIRSHAKEN, to restrict who can get a token. I think much more widespread adoption of this is who I am helps everybody. We don't want to just identify the good guys or the best guys. We want to identify everybody. And then we have a lot more tools to figure out who's doing wrong when we know who it is, and not just guessing.
Does anyone have other thoughts? Otherwise, I'll go to the next question. All right.
The question of where a voice service provider is something that is very difficult for me to get my arms around as an enforcer. I mean, you can register in Florida or Wyoming or Delaware, but your network operations center, the people that are actually touching the calls, that see the traffic, might be spread out all across the world. You could be using a third party's switch. I mean, there are so many variations in the way that these businesses operate that it's very difficult to come up with a single set of regulatory criteria and ways of classifying and organizing these businesses. And so it's difficult for the FCC to kind of find something that I think will fit all of the interested parties. You know, that being said, I wish there was a little bit more vetting of the 499 filer database, and you know, it's mostly just a ministerial process to file your paperwork with the right folks, and that could just be completely fraudulent. But you know, the industry itself changes constantly, it seems like, and there are different players operating in different little niches in the industry, and one single process for figuring out, you know, where a company is and who they are is going to be very difficult and maybe impossible to work out.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, quick plug on the KYC guide. There's a section in there on determining a real US point of presence and address, some advice on that. So take a look at that for anybody who's looking to do a little bit better qualification if they're seeing a lot of folks that are signing up with Cheyenne, Wyoming, and or UPS store. That's a common one. I've had fast food restaurants. I had a Starbucks for somebody who was looking to sign up with Numerical actually recently, so that was fun. But yeah, the address qualification is a big piece on that.
Yeah, Germany does a better job than we do on that, of requiring a real geographic address to get a number that's assigned to that territory. You've got to have a physical presence there. In the US, we have basically no standards, and we have some restrictions on original number assignment, but reassignment is basically completely unregulated. So the phone numbers have no tie to geography, or you know, they could have been sold 2 or 3 times before they get to the ultimate user of that phone number.
Yep. I mean, the fast food one, I just can't help but go to Breaking Bad. So if it's Los Pollos Hermanos, let's not. You do not want to mess with that customer. Oh, Lord. So we did kind of touch on this particular question, but I really want to call it out in its full here. Is it possible to create a profile of the bad actors or where these scam calls are coming from? And I'm assuming the question is asking for a profile so that can empower service providers, KYC, to make sure that they don't bring these bad actors on.
Yeah, I can take that. I mean, is there a profile? Yes, absolutely. You get to the point in reviewing enough of these service provider customers, or even non-service provider clients, that you get a very good sense of it within looking at somebody's information and website. You can review it for 5 minutes, and you get, you know, 90% of the time you got a good sniff test for the ones that are just not great. And a lot of that's in the information, and some of that just comes with experience and time. In terms of the more specifics for, you know, really who is on the other side of this versus how are they presenting when they're, what kinds of stuff are they presenting when they're going for contracts, which is different. Los Pollos Hermanos over here versus, you know, where they are actually located. That's where, you know, Patrick, and enforcement side, it's really hard. It's really, really hard. We're seeing a lot of shell companies, or no companies, just operating through 3 shell companies over here. And I don't think we have a good answer yet. We have a lot of, you know, if you ask somebody, where are these callers sitting? We have a pretty good idea of what countries they're probably sitting in. But if we knew down with specificity, it'd be a lot easier to pursue enforcement.
Agreed. Maybe that is something, Sarah, that I'm just giving you work here live right now. That maybe when enforcement does identify a company, maybe there's this nice little templated profile that we can extract that's, you know, certain kind of like a very consumable one pager, the company, type of customers, type of calls, right? And you know, established when, you know, just some information, and we could just keep track of that if that's, you know, there might be patterns, who knows? That might be helpful. Okay, moving on to another one. It's one thing to use KYC to understand who our direct customers are, but does the KYC model standards guide, I guess, Sarah, what you wrote, provide recommendations or policies to vet and verify the customers of the direct customers and their customers and those customers, basically the multi-layer. Does the guide provide recommendations on how to manage that?
It doesn't, mostly because one of my goals was to keep this thing short enough that people would read it without their eyes rolling in the back of their head. So it doesn't necessarily have all of that. That data, I think it's something that is critical, right? I think we're limited by, as Seth was talking about earlier, what you can know. Certainly when somebody is not yet a customer of your service, you can't know who every single one of their customers is, right? You'll get their call traffic through, but you won't necessarily be able to know in real time who they're selling services to and how that's working and which numbers are assigned to which clients. You can do a lot of that with platforms like Numerical, but out of the box, you may or may not know. So yes, it doesn't go into too much detail on that beyond just, but what I would suggest is if we can get to a world in which having a documented KYC policy is a standard, and I was really encouraged to see the FCC suggest that everybody should have a robocall mitigation plan, regardless of their STIRSHAKEN implementation status. Being able to request those standard documents and then match what's on paper, to Patrick's point, against the actual practices, right? You have a really robust policy, but you only have 2 employees, right, total. That's not happening over here. So it's one of those things where you can request the information and then doing the trust but the verify on the other side.
All right. So I think, do we time check? Do we have time for one more question?
But just to add to the last question, if I can steal a few minutes.
Yeah.
So, you know, everybody's customers are going to be different many times, right? So you might not be in the position where you know that your customer has a direct relationship with call centers and is going to be able to tell you, you know, the name and a very specific use case for what the traffic that is going to be coming to you looks like. You know, your customer may be the regional telecom that's going to have some individual voice subscriber lines, is also going to have call center customers. And, you know, maybe they have other, you know, they're also going to be sending you traffic from other intermediate carriers and things like that. When you're getting that blended traffic, I think it's really important that you have good traffic monitoring procedures to fill in the gaps with what you can know from Know Your Customer. So in the case of like the regional telecom upstream that's got all kinds of different traffic that they're sending you, you want to be looking at for instance, the mix of durations in your call detail records. So if you see that it's, you know, high percentage short duration, or like that falls into, you know, percentage of the traffic is falling into these durational buckets that does not really resemble the use case of the regional telecom, that you're asking, well, why does your traffic look like that? You know, you've got 20% less than 6 seconds, 15% between 15 and 30, and you've got almost no calls over 15 minutes. That's not what I'm expecting to see, and you know, you need to revisit whether you're going to do business with that customer. And if problems do crop up, if you get a traceback or something like that, you know, you send that on to your customer and they say, well, we've removed the source of the traffic. If you're not sure who your customer's customer is and you can't verify that assertion, then it's even more important that you be looking at the traffic. And if they tell you that we've eliminated the source of the bad traffic, but the traffic profile looks exactly the same, then that's a huge red flag. You know, if they're telling you we've eliminated this bad customer that was the source of that traceback, you need to be verifying that that's actually happened and that they're not just telling you what you want to hear so you'll turn them back on. And it should be evident from the call detail records that you're seeing for that traffic. And you don't necessarily need to evaluate them to the minute, but you do need to be doing some monitoring of that traffic's customer if you're not really 100% sure as to what the source of that traffic is.
So I think I want to close on one last question here, which kind of leads into, literally take the transcript of a lot of Patrick's words, put them in quotes, put his title, and this will help you answer this question I'm going to ask. So for service providers looking to sell the business case internally as to why we need to invest the time and resources to deploy a KYC process, how would you pitch the ROI model of investing in the process versus delaying or ignoring KYC and hoping for the best? I'm going to give my 2 cents on that. It comes in 2 parts. It is a risk mitigation and a revenue protection process. Some executives will love the words risk mitigation. You can drill down into what that means, and others will only want to hear revenue. Look, here's a little secret for executives. You put the word revenue anywhere on a document, they're going to look, because that's what they live and die by, is revenue. So it is a revenue protection model. I think at this point there is enough enforcement to help a company understand the revenue protection, because if you have an enforcement against you, you're going to lose customers. I think the hardest business case to convince is one where perhaps there is knowledge at an executive level that the revenue and the success of the company, unfortunately, is based maybe 50, 60% on the type of traffic that we really should not be servicing. That is a very difficult kind of awareness that you're going to take yourself down. And to Patrick's point, once you're aware, because then you're making decisions off of it. So those are, just kind of my perspective. Go at it from a risk mitigation and a revenue protection, and you know best for your organization how to define those. I'm sure Sarah has thoughts.
Yeah, I'd actually refer to Seth on this. I mean, he and I have been in the trenches on this, and with, advising clients, customers who have said, I'd love to get rid of this, but my leadership's not going to go for it. I'm trying, the person in front of you, I'm trying everything, and really trying to coach them through that process to really make them understand. And a lot of it, I think, is they have to believe that and be able to convince that leadership that there are real revenue and legal consequences to doing nothing here, right? Just as you were saying, Rebecca. But yeah, Seth, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
And I think that let me jump in for one thing. The FCC has issued hundreds of millions of dollars of fines and robocalls, but very little has been collected. And they've mostly been against totally fraudulent fly-by-night actors. But I think there's an appetite to issue fines against companies operating a little bit more in the gray area that might have turned a blind eye at us before, don't have good KYC, don't have a good robocall mitigation plan, and actually do have the ability to pay. Those are the companies that I would warn you're probably in the crosshairs.
Yeah, I mean, the punchline for me on this is that we have sacrificed and jettisoned millions of dollars worth of revenue in the last 12 months, 24 months. And I'm really excited about that. I've been at this company, I've been at Bandwidth for almost 10 years and seen this program grow. And it has taken a lot to get to that point, right? I'm not going to pretend like we are just we did all this because of the goodness out of our own hearts. I mean, turning again, like the cruise ship I referenced earlier, of everyone understanding that, Rebecca, you said it earlier, do you want to be the company that is playing catch up and is like, we're going to squeeze every last drop out of this industry? You're just kind of the junk outbound calling, really, is what, I always refer to it as. It's just kind of like air, a lot of it is just junk and a lot of it's downright criminal, right? Or do you want to be a leader in this space and say, the differentiator for us is when you come when you're a customer with Bandwidth, you're getting the full attention of Bandwidth. You're not getting, Bandwidth, half of it, and the rest is mitigating all this other garbage. And I think that we're getting to that point, and I want to be known as a company that is on the tip of that spear instead of one that's just waiting around to get in trouble at the end. And I think that's the only way you can get your leadership to really fully buy into it personally. And it has been a battle, as Sarah said, she was there for a lot of it, and we're still finishing it up now. But I think we've given a lot of compelling reasons on this call to certainly pay very, very close attention to it.
Well, we have demystified it, and everyone has received actionable information. And we thank Mark Robbins for the opportunity to actually share this information and for you to be able to attend. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you to close out the session.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, everyone, for a terrific panel discussion. Really appreciate it. It was very valuable. We were getting lots of responses from folks that I didn't forward on to you, how much they were enjoying it and how valuable they thought the information was. Before I hang up, I want to thank Numerical for being a platinum sponsor. Thank you for your support of the event. Also for recently joining the SIP Forum as a full member, corporate member. Really appreciate that as well.
Yep.
So guys, everybody in the audience, in about a half an hour, we'll have the last session of the day, and it's entitled Leveraging Authoritative Data to Know Your Customers' Traffic. Hope everybody can join us for that. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.